Welcome to a special edition of the Darden Admissions Podcast. I'm your host, Brett Twitty, and you are listening to a new episode. On this episode of the podcast, I'd like to share my recent conversation with Michael Albert. Michael is a member of the Data Analytics and Decision Sciences faculty here at the Darden School of Business. And this conversation was recorded as part of our ongoing faculty spotlight series, a series we call Office Hours. I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. As always, if this conversation is helpful for you, please like this episode and subscribe to this podcast so you never miss an update. And remember, you can always check the episode description for links to Darden blogs, social channels, and more. And now, without further ado, here's my conversation with Michael Albert. Well, welcome everyone to our Faculty Spotlight series, a series that we call Office Hours. I'm your host, Brett Twitty. I'm the Managing Director of Admissions for the Professional Degree Program, so lead recruitment for our professional degree programs here in the Washington, D.C. metro area. So pleased to be joined today by Michael Albert. Michael is a member of the Data Analytics and Decision Sciences faculty here at the Darden School of Business. We're going to talk about machine learning, artificial intelligence, a lot of hot topics here, Michael. So thank you so much for taking the time.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me, Brett.
And to our attendees, thank you so much for calling in from all over the world and joining us for this conversation. This is the first in a series of conversations that we're going to host through late January. So if you're interested in hearing more from faculty, be sure to take a look at our events page. We have conversations planned for November, December, as mentioned, into January. If you do have questions for Michael as we go along, we do have a structure for this conversation. We're going to spend maybe the first 15 minutes or so talking about Michael's background and what led him to Darden. Then we're going to talk about some of the classes that he teaches and his work with the MSBA program, which is a partner program between the Darden School of Business and the McIntyre School of Commerce here at UVA. And then we're going to spend, I think, a good bulk of the conversation talking about hot topics in artificial intelligence. Not that there are any hot topics to discuss in that particular area, but we'll do our best. So if you do have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A as we go along here. But Michael, let's start off with a good first question. So tell us a little bit more about you.
Yeah, so I'm a Virginia native, which is one of the reasons that I eventually came back to UVA. But I have spent time at various universities, and I've had a somewhat non-standard kind of academic journey. So I did my PhD at Duke in the business school there. My PhD is in financial economics. But during my PhD, I developed a real passion for machine learning, and I started taking classes in the computer science department. I ended up with a master's in computer science while I was doing my PhD, and got involved in research at the intersection of machine learning and economics. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means later. But I was fortunate enough to, as I developed this kind of new research area and this passion, I was able to spend some time in AI groups at computer science departments at UT Austin, then back at Duke in the computer science department there. Before eventually coming to Darden in about 2018 to join the Data Analytics and Decision Sciences faculty. It's been it was a bit of a winding path to get here, but it's been great to be here.
And I'm curious, what sparked your interest in machine learning? What got you interested way back when?
Yeah, well, so I think in economics you do a lot of modeling and prediction, and the emphasis is often on prediction as a way to understand the world. We want to build a model to predict, not because we actually care that much about the prediction, because understanding how we're predicting tells us something about the world in which we live in, right? This is in some sense a very kind of scientific question. I think this was kind of the approach that a lot of economists really take. And a lot of my colleagues here at Darden, and my former colleagues at Duke and elsewhere, I realized that wasn't really where my passions lied. That I think, in some ways I discovered that I was a bit more of an engineer than a scientist. And, the computer science perspective, the machine learning perspective, is that prediction by itself is useful, right? Like, we care less about, understanding the world through building this model, and more about, being able to build an accurate model that then gives us power to make better decisions in kind of downstream tasks, right? That this again moves from modeling as kind of a scientific exercise to understand the world to modeling as an engineering exercise, and that I think transition that was really powerful for me. When I kind of when that I had that kind of light bulb moment sitting in a machine learning class and that was taught by the computer science department at Duke, it really kind of transformed the way I thought about research, about what I wanted to do in my own line of research.
You mentioned your connection to UVA. What ultimately brought you to Dart?
Many things. First, I I've always really loved to teach. I've taught at various levels since I graduated college, from middle school, all the way up to PhD classes, and it's been a real passion for me. And one of the things that Darden is, that I knew about Darden before coming here, and I've only been confirmed by being here, is that Darden is a community of passionate teachers. The faculty are all passionate teachers. And so, there are many places I could have gone. There are very few places that valued teaching at the level that Darden does. Um, and not only valued teaching, but valued a community of valued a community of students that were prepared and receptive to be taught. And I think that was the distinction. I could have put the same amount of effort in, at anywhere else. And I was at Ohio State for a couple of years. It was a great school, and I loved my time there. But I couldn't teach the way that I do at Darden at Ohio State because we build a culture among the students, among the faculty that just lends itself to an educational experience that's really unique. And so that was super important to me in deciding to come to Darden. Like I said, I'm a Virginia native. I grew up about an hour away from Charlottesville. I loved the area. One of the great joys of being at UVA is being in the Charlottesville area. It's just a wonderful town, beautiful four seasons, mountains you can get to easily, close to home. So, along many dimensions. And, I haven't even gone into the fact that they're very supportive of my research, but along many dimensions, it was just an easy decision to come here.
You mentioned the sort of culture around learning at Darden as that being something that's distinctive.
Yeah.
How would you describe that to folks who are maybe on this call and just learning about this for the first time?
Yeah. Well, so I think the ethos at Darden is that we're a student-centered learning experience. That fundamentally, as a faculty member, I'm not coming to the classroom to impart wisdom. These are professional programs. We have a wealth of experience in the classroom. Yes, I have some technical knowledge that I do impart as I'm teaching, and I provide materials that help illuminate that technical knowledge. But the learning experience is really driven by the students, right? What I do as a faculty member is I work to bring out the experience in a discussion in a way that everybody can learn from each other. Um, this works because people are well prepared for the learning experience. They come having, gone through materials, cases in particular, that set up a realistic business problem, and they've thought about them, they discussed them, they've done pre-work on it, they've read technical notes that help illuminate the technical concepts. And so when we come to class, we end up being able to having a robust discussion where we can get into the nuance and the nitty-gritty of what's going on in a very practical, applied way.
So I want to transition and talk about your research a little bit more. So your research focuses on machine learning and algorithmic techniques to automate the design of markets. I had to look at my notes on that. I just want to make sure I got it exactly right.
Yeah.
What exactly does that mean?
Yeah, well, so let me kind of start by setting up the standard machine learning problem. And understanding how what I do differs from that, I think it helps illuminate it. So the standard machine learning problem says, here's a bunch of data. Here's something you'd like to predict, to make this concrete. Maybe you have a bunch of interactions with customers. For you're a company that has some kind of recurring relationship with customers. You've got a bunch of historical interactions with them. You know what kind of services they've bought. How often they've called customer service. Whatever else. And then you have some target variable, for example, whether or not they leave the service, what we call churn, whether or not the customers churn. and you'd like to predict whether or not a customer is likely to churn. And if you can do this, then you can do all sorts of things like preemptively offer discounts and stuff like that. So that makes sense in a lot of settings. However, there are some settings where this kind of model breaks down. Um, let's think about a pricing example. So, in here's uh, a this probably most directly applies to things like online advertising. So, in online advertising, you the same set of buyers, they enter an auction to bid on the ad that you see at the top of Google search, or the banner that you see on the top of a web page. Though those things are allocated by somebody bidding on you in particular as a user, or a set of characteristics that's communicated to these advertisers. And they submit a bid, and that this winning bid gets the ad slot. You see the ad, and if you click on it, then they pay. They can be set up in different ways, but this is the basic structure. In many of these settings, there's often only a couple of bidders, sometimes as few as one, oftentimes actually as few as one. And so the way these things are really set up is that, and these settings is that the advertising platform, Google, the website, whatever, might have to set a price. They say, okay, well, you've got to just pay 25 cents for this ad, if you'd like it to be shown. That advertiser can start to play games. I might estimate that 25 cents is a good price to charge. I might have built a complicated machine learning model to estimate that 25 cents is a good price. However, that advertiser might know that I'm trying to estimate what a good price might be, and they might play games with me to try to get that price to be lowered. So, for example, they might be perfectly happy to buy it at 25 cents, but instead they may choose not to buy the ad to try to convince me that 25 cents is too high. So then in the future, they can buy that ad for 15 cents. What's broken between the traditional setting is that there's now a strategic agent on the other side. There's somebody who can kind of manipulate the system, that can take the machine learning model and try to subvert its goals through its own intentional behavior, right? It's not a passive data set anymore. And in this case, you have to be a little bit more clever in terms of how you combine kind of the market design problem with the machine learning problem. Okay, well, I'm building out something that's going to ultimately set a price. How do I do that without, you know, messing up the learning aspect of it?
That's very interesting. What got you interested in this work in particular? Was there a particular experience that you had or something that sparked this for you?
Yeah, well, I, I'll share this anecdote. This is why I was a PhD student. I was quite poor at the time, and I realized it wasn't exactly gaming a market. Well, it was gaming a marketplace. It wasn't doing it in the exact way that I kind of currently frame my research questions, but I had a subscription service that I'd gotten for 1 month in order to um use the subscription service for a month, something like Netflix, right? And then I was going to cancel it after I'd had this 1 month use. But during that month, they sent me an email saying that I could, if I referred a friend, they would give me $20 in cash. Like a pay, they would send me $20 on PayPal. Um, and I realized this was, I don't know, 2010 or so, that I could actually just buy Google Ads with my referral link, uh, advertising for the service. It cost me about 30 cents to get a referral. And every referral that I got, they paid me $20 for. And so what I ended up becoming, unexpectedly was a very, high-priced advertising consultant for this company that didn't know what they were doing. um, this lasted for about 2 glorious months. It wasn't massive amounts of money, but as a PhD student, it felt like a significant bump to my income. And then they must have realized what was happening, and they actually. So in order to have this ad, I had to include because it was in the URL. Google had a policy that you had to include the trademark for in the ad that you had, this company. You had to include their name because it was part of the URL. Um, and what I learned from this is that trademark owners have explicit control over what kinds of ads they can veto ads that are being shown under their trademark. And so they started vetoing my ads. They started, they shut me down. I could no longer get my ads to appear on Google search. But it gave me this insight into this, world in which, like, there are all of these kind of like, perverse incentives, right? It's a data rich, data heavy world. Um, and we, and there's all sorts of ways that things can be gamed. There's controls to try to avoid that, but they have kind of unintended consequences. And so it was that was what I think one of these early kind of illuminating moments for me. Like, oh, okay, well, there's a lot of really interesting questions in this space.
Yeah, I don't anticipate that they expected someone with that $20 for a friend to then go out and advertise, in
Oh
that kind of
no,
way. Funny story.
yeah,
Want to talk a little bit about your work with the MSBA program. This is our MS
yeah,
in Business Analytics program. As I mentioned, it's a partner program between Darden and the McIntyre School of Commerce. It's 12 months. It is a program that puts students very squarely at the intersection of data science and business. What do you teach in this program? Tell us a little bit more about that.
yeah. So I a good portion of my teaching allocation is to this Masters of Science in Business Analytics, and it's a great program. It's a 1 year program. Working professionals. Similar kind of in model to like our executive MBA program, um, where we have Zoom classes and times we get together on the weekends. Um, but this program is really, its focus. It's a more tightly focused program than the MBA program because it's a year long. We don't have as much time to cover kind of the breadth of material that you do in an MBA, and the real emphasis is on practical business focused analytics. So, what I teach there is I teach in the first half of the program. I teach two courses. One called Enterprise Decision Analysis, which is a course on how you make decisions under uncertainty. So, we're always going to be uncertain about the world. And the question is, how do you still make principled, effective decisions, recognizing that you don't know everything? How do you start to quantify what uncertainty looks like? How do you start to quantify what knowledge looks like? These are all questions we get to in that class. My follow-on course is called Data Analytics 1. And really it's the first course in a set of three that's really heavily focused on machine learning. So what I teach in that class is I start to teach students how to program in a programming language called Python, which is the lingua franca for data science and analytics really right now. And we go into advanced kind of predictive modeling. So, we go all the way from kind of very standard analytics tools like linear regression, if you ever heard of that, all the way up to, complicated nonlinear machine modeling tools. And as part of that, we have partnered with UVA Advancement to build predictive models for uh, donation behavior for alumni in order to help them think about how they do outreach to alumni, how they optimize the advancement process. So there's a very kind of practical hands-on component to it where we have a real client who we're really building models for and really presenting our solutions. So it combines both kind of these technical aspects with trying to figure out how to communicate the value of these technical contributions to a non-technical audience.
Yeah, that's one of the things I really like about the MSBA program is when people first think about something like business analytics or data science, they're thinking about purely technical work. But the MSBA program also has this emphasis on communication and strategy and kind of
Yep.
understanding the business context and business purpose. And it really does position students well to be translators between the technical people and the business people to sort of sit in that middle role. And there's obviously as you talked about, each module, it's the 5 modules across the 12 months. Each one has a project deliverable that students are working on, and that project has a presentation component to it. And
Yep.
so you're not just getting just purely technical. There's also this layering of business and also communication and these other things.
Yeah, I think that's one of the real strengths of the program. It's very tightly integrated. All the courses kind of work towards, in each module, as we call them, all the courses work towards that one project. So while I'm teaching data analytics, we have another faculty member who's teaching storytelling with data. How do you visualize data in a real compelling way and tell a story around that, right? We have another who's teaching marketing analytics, who are really, customer focused kind of marketing analytics tools that's all combined into one, cohesive final project that we deliver to a client. It's really very practical, very hands-on, very cohesive, and it's one of the great things about it. Very well said, Brett.
Yeah. Well, I wanna talk about your elective too, 'cause, perhaps
Mhm.
some maybe people doing some advanced research, for this office hour session, which
Yeah.
oftentimes happens once we announce the guests. You have an elective machine learning and AI for business, and, I have to imagine that's a pretty popular elective these days.
Well, it is, you know, it's a hard elective, and so it is popular. I think it's also an elective that's stretching, which is one of the pitches that I have for that class, and I think for a graduate degree in general, and for Darden in particular, is that it's a wonderful time to stretch yourself, right? So I teach this class, machine learning and AI for business. It's an elective here at Darden, um, and a uh, you know, Darden is not it's a, the MBA program is not it's not a highly technical degree, right? We're not expecting people to come in with, computer science backgrounds. We're not expecting people to be engineers, in fact, I see a question in the chat, whether or not you need a background in computer science to work with machine learning and AI tools. And I think I can answer it by my experience teaching this course. So the class is set up for people with no technical background in this. Nobody. There are always some portion of our students who were software engineers in a previous life, but it's a very small portion. The vast majority of people in the class have never worked with any kind of programming tool, but they're enthusiastic about trying to understand the fundamentals of machine learning and AI, and more importantly, understand how those things can actually drive value. Right, the basic thesis of the class is that understanding the technical details, and at least at a high level, helps you understand the value proposition much better, right? One of the things we're seeing right now in the AI industry is that there's a lot of good marketing around AI, and maybe less, strong substance behind that marketing, right? And the goal of the class is to help students who come out of it have a much better foundation for trying to parse, okay, well, what is the actual technical contribution? Is it likely to actually drive value? The class starts with, it's taught in the programming language Python as well. So, and people who take it generally have no exposure to any kind of programming language, no CS background, nothing like that. Um, but through a series of case studies, through some example code that I provide, through things like coding assistants that are, AI based, it tends to be very accessible to current, non-technical students, to students who have very little background. We go all the way from, again, the kind of, the simplest machine learning models, all the way up to talking about what it means to, you build a large language model, the things that power things like ChatGPT. We work with, structured data, things that fit into spreadsheets, kind of the normal like business data, but we also work with unstructured data. We look at images and text and audio as inputs to these modeling processes. But importantly, all the time, we're not looking at these tools as tools in and of themselves, like you might in a machine learning course in a, computer science department, or a, data science degree or something like that. The emphasis is always on, how do we solve a concrete business problem with these tools? How do we ultimately drive value with these tools? How do we make better decisions with these tools, or create a compelling product with these tools?
I appreciate, hearing all of that. I was curious about the sort of non-technical people. How do they engage in this class? It's great to hear that there's a lane for them, and it's very, very accessible. Can you give us an example of a case or a simulation you work through in this course just to kinda, again, help people visualize what you're doing?
Yeah, so here's an early one that we go through, and um I have this data set. It's for used cars. It's provided by Carvana, if you're familiar with Carvana, and we set up this problem, and that Carvana has to source. They're a used car dealer here in the U.S., a national used car dealer. They're an online used car dealer, and we set up this problem of, okay, well, you know, Carvana has to source high quality cars. And maybe that's more important for them. The case is set in 2013, when buying cars on the internet was even less common than it is today. And, still think many people are uncomfortable with purchasing a car on the internet, especially a used car. And so they really have to be careful in how they source cars to make sure that they don't, end up buying what we refer to as lemons or kicks, bad cars, and um, and then potentially selling them on to a customer and kind of tanking their reputation, right? Because people who buy cars online are also people who are very likely to post about their experience online, and so they can, they're exposed to a lot of reputation risk here. So they've got this, unique sourcing problem that makes it, maybe harder for them to source used cars, and they're working at a scale that's very different than kind of a traditional used car dealer. So we've got this data set, and the goal is to use this data set to predict which cars are likely to be bad, to be lemons or kicks. Um, and I have the students go through and kind of with guided code, they're able to build these complicated machine learning models. And one of the things that we get out of this is kind of what data points were most impactful for the machine learning model. I'm giving away a bit of the punchline here, so when you take my class, please act surprised. The uh, the one of the data points that is most impactful is this variable called wheel type, and specifically whether or not that data is missing in this data set. So it turns out that if this data set with this particular variable called wheel type is missing, then the car is overwhelmingly likely to be a bad buy. Um, and so it's such an important piece of data. We have to kind of wrestle with, what does this mean for our decision, right? We have this predictive model. Well, it turns out that this wheel type missing, by and large, means that the car doesn't have wheels. And that's a pretty easy thing to identify as a bad buy. And so, like, you kind of look at this model naively. So you build this nice machine learning model, and you take it and you say, okay, well, we can use it to decide which cars to buy. And if you do that, it looks like it's fantastic. Like, you have increased your margin on cars by roughly like 30%. I mean, it's a really huge lift for not a lot of work. And then you go and you say, okay, well, it turns out that these cars that we're saying not to buy, a large portion of them don't have wheels. And what if we had just told our car buyers to not buy cars without wheels, which would be something much simpler than building a machine learning model? Well, then the actual value of the model is much, much lower. I mean, it's still valuable. You're still increasing your margin by 5%, which is great when you're working at scale, right? But the entire kind of value proposition changes once you really start to understand what's happening in this machine learning model. You're digging into the data, you're understanding what the implications of that are for the business decision. All these things work together to come up with a kind of a cohesive, value proposition for the client, which if you just approached it technically, you wouldn't get. If you approached it just from a business perspective, like, you would never be able to build the model, right? Like, we really need these marriage of these kind of, ways of thinking about these problems in order to drive value for the organization.
Thank you for sharing that question here in the Q&A. If people are curious and kind of just want to learn, one programming language to get some exposure here, what would you recommend?
Python. I like, unless, so if you want to do analytics, or machine learning or something like that, Python is the language. If you want to do something like build web pages, that's very different, and you probably should talk to somebody else to ask about that. But if you're interested in analytics or machine learning, Python is the language to learn.
It's
100%.
interesting. One of the things that I've talked with Raj Venkatesan, who is a leader, one of the academic directors
Mhm.
of the MSBA program, as well as involved in the AI Institute at Darden.
Mhm.
One of the things he's noted about Python and some of these tools is they are increasingly pushing towards automation, the coding becoming less and less
Yeah.
important. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts about that. Do you find that to be true? Are they becoming sort of is the coding becoming less important, or is it still important for users?
So I actually think, and Raj and I disagree a bit on this. I think, and I can point to some research that supports my position. Um, I think the coding is becoming more important, not less important. So I think what we are seeing is that uh, AI tools like ChatGPT or other things are able to write code relatively well. However, if there are some studies of experienced software engineers that have actually given some have presented some evidence that at least for some classes of problems they are a productivity negative. Even though they write code well, they're not writing code in exactly the way that you're expecting them to write. So you have to spend a lot of time fixing them. If you can't code at all, well then like you don't even know where to start to fix. And so, oftentimes what here's, I use AI coding assistants all the time. In my class, I provide one to students when they're as a way to help the learning process. I think they are a wonderful tool and really maybe one of the big success stories around the current AI industry. But I think they're primarily an accelerant for people who already understand the fundamentals of programming. Because so often you have to fix something that's not right. And part of that's not because the codes couldn't write the correct code, but if you're trying to tell this AI agent enough details to write the code correctly, well, it turns out that is nearly as hard, maybe harder than just writing the code yourself. Like we write code in it's a language. We write code in a language in order to specify what we'd like to happen. If you have to use natural language, well, natural language is less suited for these kinds of tasks than these purpose-built programming languages. But once you have the fundamentals, these things are huge accelerants for certain kinds of tasks. Like I can build a web app in probably 30 minutes that would have taken me, a week of time before, right? Once I have a little bit of an understanding, they become huge accelerants. So in that sense, I think actually learning the fundamentals is more important than ever because you can then leverage your fundamental understanding for huge gains. I think it's less clear that we can, without the fundamentals, learn to code or learn to leverage these tools independent of being able to write, kind of at a fundamental level.
Yeah, that's helpful to hear your perspective. I'm always interested in these conversations as someone who is not as familiar with these tools. It's helpful to hear those insights. Have you seen an increasing interest amongst Darden students in artificial intelligence?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think Darden is interacting with it in many different ways. I teach one, probably the most technical course on kind of artificial intelligence. We have other courses that are trying to think about the impacts of artificial intelligence on the workforce and on how and manage employees and how you think about it in your own work and your own time. Um, but I mean, it's hard to ignore the, I would say, in many settings, if you're not explicitly talking about AI, it's at least one of the elephants in the room, right? It's just too big of a technology with implications that are too big to ever really push to the side.
Yeah, and I know that there's been a great conversation, students coming back from their summer internships and sharing feedback about the tools that they use and experiences that they've had. And I've heard there's an elective coming, kind of the end of the first year, about the business applications of Gen AI that
Mhm.
students can take. It's largely asynchronous, so there's no cap on enrollment. This is what's been shared with us on the admissions
Okay.
team. That sounds like a really exciting class.
Yeah, I actually am not aware of it.
Okay.
So this is news to me. That's great. I think that there's so many different, you know, again, I am my thoughts on kind of the short term uh effects of AI on productivity are mixed, but long term, I think we're dealing with some profound fundamental shifts in our, global economy, and we need to be it would be unjust of us as a business school to not spend a lot of time preparing students for wrestling with these questions.
Yeah, I want to ask sort of about that before we get into some more of your research. Um, Interesting conversation around some of these artificial intelligence companies. You know,
Mhm.
haven't yet to really turn a significant profit. The investment is significant. I think you recently had OpenAI saying need somewhere in the neighborhood of like $1 trillion worth of investment. Do you feel like these technologies are getting to a plateau? Like, where are we right now? You think on that journey?
Yeah, so, there's, you're exactly right. The scale of investment is huge, there's, like, I think OpenAI last reporting period generated like $13 billion in revenue. That's not profit, $13 billion in revenue with like, you know, half a trillion dollars in investments, right? It's really asymmetric between kind of revenue and investments at this point in time. Um, I think there is some evidence that we're slowing down in the rate of progress. I actually don't think that's a surprise. That For you know, kind of people who were seriously in this space, as when I go to AI conferences, I don't think anybody is surprised that we're not seeing kind of the big leaps we had, in 22, 23, 24. There's a perception that GPT-5 was a potentially something of a flop. I think what actually, if you look at it more closely, I think a lot of that is driven by, kind of vibes, the feelings of using these models, less than the actual kind of metrics that I think are more relevant for a lot of businesses. One of the things that we're seeing models kind of shift to is much better instruction following capabilities, right? So, this allows models to basically work for longer on larger tasks because they're less likely to kind of go off script. So one of the metrics that I'm tracking is there's a research organization, METR, um, out of California, that has a series of tests they put new models through that looks at, kind of how long a model can work on a task alone, where they've calibrated these tasks for how long it takes a human to do the task. And uh, you know, maybe a year and a half ago, it was about 3 minutes. The model could work for on a task and successfully solve tasks that took humans about 3 minutes. Now, models like GPT-5 are able to solve tasks reliably that take humans, not all tasks, but a meaningful subset of tasks, reliably that take humans over an hour. And so, if you're extrapolating, and extrapolation is always a dangerous thing, there's some expectation that by the end of next year, we could have models that solve tasks that would take a human a week. And by the time you're getting to week-long tasks, like, you could start replacing, whole job functions at that point, right? Not just augmentation, but replacement. Um, and the way we're scaling now is changing. We're moving away from just training on the internet to putting these models, giving them actual problems, and then having them try to solve them, and then rewarding them when they're being solved. And this is something that requires massive amounts of compute to kind of train this way. This is actually much, much more compute intensive. So the promise is still that we're going to see, relatively large productivity gains from these AI models. And the cost is still that we actually need much more compute budgets in order to do that. It's maybe the extrapolations are wrong. And in that case, we these AI companies maybe have gotten ahead of their skis. But I certainly think there's still a reasonable possibility that these investments are well justified.
One of the things that was interesting about what you mentioned, and I'm curious to follow up on something that you mentioned in passing, is sort of profound changes for business that's being driven by these technologies. You mentioned the need for more compute. Obviously, that's capital intensive. There's environmental consequences of that as well has been discussed. You got to put all these data centers somewhere. This is a portion of our economy in the United States, at least, it seems to be still growing. But how are you thinking about this, from a business standpoint? If you're leading a company right now, what are some of the changes that you think you might have to reckon with as a result of these technologies?
So it- I think one of the things that we're seeing is we're starting to see a lot of articles that are along the lines of like, company tried AI, didn't find any value in it, right? 90% of companies have found no return on their AI investments. And by and large, what I think that's because a lot of people are using kind of AI in the wrong way. They don't really understand what it is, and they're using it like a replacement for Google search or search in their inbox or something, right? And I think that that's interesting, and like I use it as a replacement for Google search some, and like that's fine. But I don't think we're ever going. Google search was already really good, right? We're not we're replacing one thing that was already pretty good with something that's slightly better. You're not going to see big productivity gains, and probably not even going to justify the costs that you're looking at. Um, what I think is more promising, but I think is being sold poorly, is this move to what we call agentic AI, where we have these AI agents that are supposed to be doing tasks on our behalf. I think the difficulty there is that for a lot of people, they don't understand, they don't have kind of a good, deep understanding of the limitations of of what these models can and can't do. So they pick automation tasks that actually are poorly suited, right? And then they don't evaluate well how the automation is going, and so they don't really know what it's doing. They can't optimize. They can't kind of tweak the process until it goes better because they don't really have a good clear objective for how the automation is going in the first place. And so this kind of agentic rollout is also not profitable. I think as people, are and maybe companies who are selling these things get a little bit better about communicating, what well scoped tasks look like, what good clear metrics of success look like, what data pipelines look like for tracking these metrics, and how we continuously optimize and make them better. I think we are going to start seeing, a real economic value being created. But it requires business leaders to have a more than just a surface level understanding. If they're thinking about AI as ChatGPT, they're not really thinking about it in the right way. I don't think. I think they need to think about AI as as custom solutions, often for specific relatively well scoped tasks that their company is dealing with, uh, and that they can kind of scale. So that's my recommendation. And as I do some external work with companies, this is where I'm trying to help companies grow, is helping them kind of match the capabilities to the problem, and then figure out appropriate metrics to measure success.
What you just shared there, I think, is super interesting and maybe a good highlight for our attendees today about the work that faculty do with actual practitioners, right? You're
Yep.
talking to companies out there in the world. Can you tell us? I mean, obviously, you probably can't talk about the exact companies, but can you tell us a little bit more about that work? How does it come to you? How do you get involved with it?
Yeah. So it's we're at a business school. It is really valuable to us to work with businesses. It turns out, that's a real benefit, not only to like it's great to work with businesses, to have that opportunity, but it informs what I do in the classroom because I get to see what companies are actually struggling with. It informs how I think about research because I get to, like solve some real problems for businesses and understand where their actual pain points are. Sometimes that leads directly to research questions that I can address. And sometimes it's just uh, a, a different way to frame, how I've been thinking about my own research. So yeah, generally speaking, most companies that I've worked with, I sign an NDA, so I can't generally talk about specifics. But they typically find me oftentimes through a Darden connection. So somebody took my class. They were talking with a either a colleague or they're working at a company that they know they have problems that could benefit from greater expertise than they have internally, and they reach out to me, and then through as I've done this work through kind of referrals from other companies. Um, Generally speaking, when I work with companies, a lot of it is helping them frame problems because you know with these technical tools, I think the most important way, the most important step in a lot of times is matching the tools to the right kind of problem. Companies will come often with a very kind of nebulous idea of what they'd like to do, and, and maybe in a perfect world, they have a specific problem they'd like to solve, but they may not have the data necessary. That problem may not be amenable to the kind of tools that are available, even modern AI tools, right? Um, and so, a lot of the engagements is helping companies to think, okay, well, you know, how are the problems that you're currently facing? How do they, directly match up with the set of tools in a standard kind of analyst, machine learning experts tool bag, right? Once we've matched that up, I often will help them build kind of a proof of concept. As an expert in this area, I'm generally not going to spend time on kind of implementing something that's better done internally, where people, internal teams kind of have buy-in for whatever we're building out. But I build a proof of concept. Either it's some kind of AI tool or it's a predictive model, and they can then take that and work with it internally. But I'm able to set up kind of a good metric for them, help them to start the process of measuring, go through a round of implementation and iteration, and they take it from there.
Yeah, super interesting. I want to come back to also something you were talking about is like sort of the short-term view on artificial intelligence may be a little bit murky, like what you might gain from it, but obviously incredible benefits long term. Do you worry about that, what that might mean in terms of the level of investment? Are people going to get impatient at some point? I mean, with all the money that's going into compute and building all this capability, uh, is it possible for people just to say, "You know what? I think this is too much. We can't actually afford all this. We're gonna pull back," and then the whole thing kind of collapses a little bit? Obviously, there's been some stories recently about a potential AI
I,
bubble,
I
so
I think there's a perception that an increasing perception that there is an AI bubble. Um, and frankly, maybe there is an AI bubble, right? Like even if this technology is, hugely transformative, but it's transformative in 50 years time, then what we're seeing now is probably an AI bubble, right? Um, I think that some companies, the big tech firms, they even if with the massive amounts of investments that they're looking at, they can afford it. They like, and I think they're probably not expecting to see big returns in the next few years. I think that this is no inside information here, but this is my own read of their strategy, is that they're viewing this, in a kind of a startup focused manner. That they're really trying to do is they're trying to gain technical expertise and market share. That those two things are hugely valuable, and much like Google search, went from by kind of dominating the market, was able to extract huge rents from that later on. I think that's probably the game plan here. And so for those companies, I think their kind of mass level investments make sense. There's some companies that need more immediate returns. CoreWeave being one that's been widely in the news, building data centers and taking on a lot of debt. They have to service that debt, and they, their whole business model is predicated on people wanting to fill their data centers with high priced GPUs, which depreciate very fast. And you know that is it's harder to say whether or not companies like CoreWeave are going to run into problems, and if they do, what kind of the network effects are going to be for that. Um, my own view is that is enough value right now in compute that even if we saw, and maybe this would, it could even be a good thing in the long run for the industry. Even if we saw some pullback, we've already invested enough that like those GPUs are still going to be there. Um, we, they people may charge less to actually run code on them, which might be good for a startup community around AI, right? They're not going to turn off the GPUs. They're going to figure out some way to continue to extract value from them. Um, so, there I suspect we'll probably see some pullback in AI spending from some portion of the players, and there's probably some that won't that have gotten overly enthusiastic. But I don't think that this infrastructure spending boom is in the same level of kind of bubble as we saw with in like the dot-com era or the like the housing crash in 2008, where we had a lot of subprime lending. Even CoreWeave is actually paying a lot for its debt. Like, people understand CoreWeave is risky. They're lending to it with a high risk premium on their debt. So this is being priced into the market, the fact that these companies are risky. It's not, people aren't just throwing money at AI companies. And I think that pushes a little bit against the AI bubble narrative. But the market has whipsawed this past week. So, maybe, stocks will fall 50% over the next month, and I will regret having said this.
Well, it's always tough to be making these predictions, but I do it's very much in the news, right? And it feels like
Yeah.
there's, very different camps. There's all kinds of positions on this. Some people that are big naysayers, doomsayers in some cases, and other people are very optimistic, and other people are sort of in the middle and skeptical. One of the things that Darden has really staked its claim to is sort of the ethical use of AI and sort of thinking, and it fits very much with the sort of view here about responsible leadership. And so, what does
Yeah.
ethical AI mean to you, Michael? How do you understand that?
Yeah, uh I think there's a lot of components to ethical AI. I think that there is um you know I think one of the things that we're seeing and that we expect to see is inequity. That if the AI boom is not a bubble, there's been huge returns to people who own capital. And I think there's at least some evidence that we're seeing people who don't own capital being kind of left behind. And so one of the questions is, okay, well, how do we as a society adjust to that kind of inequity? How do we bring people along um, with the potential prosperity that greater capabilities, greater automation, greater opportunities AI provides? Um, so part of this is about access. Who has access to these tools? Um, who has access to use them kind of well, right? Like, we're seeing a lot of a term that's being thrown around a lot right now is AI slop and work slop, right? I think that one of the things that we're struggling with as a society is that these tools have made production of some kind of content much easier, but that content is often low quality. And so people who don't want to spend a lot of time on a task at work can, easily generate something with AI and then send it off to their colleagues, and the colleagues have to fix the poor job that they did, right? And so it actually creates more work, and potentially this is part of the explanation for why people aren't seeing, productivity gains. And there's some narrative, at least, that some portion of employees are actually experiencing productivity losses as a result of low quality AI generated content. So, like, how do we build cultures that encourage the use of AI in ways that actually provides value and doesn't just allow somebody to demonstrate the appearance of work while being lazy, right? Yeah, I am not an ethicist, and I would say that some of my work is very kind of like, you know, hyper rational, hyper, focused on optimization. And so these questions are ones that I love talking with my colleagues about, because we have some of the world's, leading thinkers on business ethics here. And it's really great to be able to engage with them on these kinds of topics. Um, for me, I find it to be a very challenging question, and I'm glad that we have people who are better suited to work on it.
Well, thank you for indulging the question. I know it's very broad, lots of things to talk
Yeah.
about. We have a conference coming up in December that the Lacrosse Institute will be sponsoring it in Charlottesville. So, for folks who are in the area, they're curious about that. Consider joining us. For that, I want to close out by just talking a little bit more about one of your areas of interest, which is designing a market for data used by AI tools. And there's so much around this because how to it's obviously the conversation all about how all these large language models got trained in the first place. You have various lawsuits that have come up as a result of that. But how do you think about the data that's being used to train AI tools and designing a market for it?
So this is a great follow-up to the ethics question, and frankly, I should have brought it up, in response to the ethics question. I think one of the yeah, so, right now, AI is just AI companies have just, hoovered up a whole bunch of data from the internet to train kind of first generation of models. And we're starting to see pushback on that. So, Anthropic, recently settled which with a, class action lawsuit with a bunch of authors, and I can't remember the exact number, but it was something like $300 billion was the class action lawsuit payout. I mean, maybe I got that even wrong by an order of magnitude, but it was some incredibly huge number, right? But even with that, I think the actual payment to authors is something like $3,000 per book, right? It's not very much, in the grand scheme of things. You spend all this time working on a book. Well, Anthropic has uses to train their model, and maybe the model can now talk about what was in your book, and maybe people don't need to buy it, then you could easily imagine losing more than $3,000 in revenue, as a consequence. Um, right now, there's really, this is just kind of the state of the world where courts are trying to figure out, is training fair use? Is it not? There's other questions, not just around training, but um, companies are using like text from websites to answer specific questions. So you go to ChatGPT and you ask it a question, it'll go do a Google search, it'll read, something from somebody's blog, somebody who may have been selling ads on their blog, and who's written up about some question, come back and tell you the answer to that question. And now I don't go to that person's blog anymore and click on their blog and see the ad, and therefore they get paid due to having shown an ad, right? Um, Kind of the economic bargain that was struck in the early days of the internet, this traffic driven, advertising driven business model is kind of breaking down. And so, one of the things that I'm working on, other people are working on. There's been some really interesting new kind of a web protocol called Really Simple Licensing (RSL). It was created by the same people who created the Really Simple Syndication Protocol, or RSS, um, where you can specify that AI bots can only you know access your website if they pay you some amount per access or something. This doesn't fully solve the problem because it turns out that more than one person writes on the internet. And so oftentimes the AI bot can choose between two different websites to read. And if one website is willing to charge less, well, it's going to read that one, right? And eventually, market dynamics should drive the price of this, the access to websites very low. And so you still may not, as a content producer or somebody who's creating these websites, you still may not generate much in the way of economic benefits. And so, a recent paper that I have is currently under submission, looks at, okay, well, how do we create coalitions of data providers, of sellers, that allow us to to bid or to set prices, not just as an individual, which market forces will drive down, but allow us to set prices as a coalition, which might be more sustainable, more reflective of the actual value. But then we have to distribute fairly among these data providers, the revenue that's received, and that's a hard technical question that requires understanding the deep technical aspects of the model. And so we combine kind of the technical understanding of the machine learning models, these AI models, with these market dynamics to try to solve some of these economic problems that are being created by kind of the rapidly changing web that we're seeing.
Yeah, that's super interesting because you think about the news media, right? An industry that has been totally in transformation. It's been all kinds of things happening to disrupt that business model, moving from print to online. Okay, now you're selling ads, but then all of these some of these tools come along that just basically, no one's visiting your website anymore. Not going to pay for a subscription. Maybe it just gets pulled into an AI search or that sort of thing. I mean, if you're a news organization, what are you thinking about right now?
Well, so, I'm not an expert in traditional media, but my understanding is that news organizations have historically sold narrative. They've sold stories, right? Not facts. Like you go to the New York Times because you like the way that the New York Times frames a fact. You go to Fox News because you like the way Fox News frames a fact, right? You go to whatever news provider, not just for facts. You can get facts all over the place, but because you're buying a narrative that goes along with that facts. Um, Now it turns out that AI tools, one of the things that they're best at is creating narrative, right? And creating narrative in ways that are highly customized for individual users. They can be optimized for engagement and likes and all sorts of things, right? And so this traditional kind of value add that these news organizations have provided beyond the collection of facts, and the collection of facts, it turns out you only need really one person. ChatGPT can go to the Associated Press, and if the New York Times won't sell them the facts, but OpenAI can construct a narrative around those facts and do it in a way that it, at least on a surface level, can mimic a lot of the style that you see from the New York Times or Fox News or CNN or whatever other news source. Um, and so this is it's a real problem for traditional media providers that facts are something that, again, market forces should drive the price of facts very low. Facts are very valuable to us as a society. Um, and the thing that was a differentiator of this narrative is no longer something that's kind of, we can replicate that very cheaply. And so what happens to these news organizations is a hard question. Um, and it's maybe somewhat depends on whether or not they can kind of figure out how to come together as a coalition, and keep the price of facts from being driven too low.
Well, lots. I can think of all the conversations that can continue from this
Sure.
conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and be willing to engage in these hot topic conversations,
Yeah.
recognizing that who knows where all of this is
Oh yeah.
exactly going. I want to ask is, are there any recommendations for folks who've gotten interest in these topics? Are there a few books that you might recommend for people
Mhm.
who want to learn more, who want to engage more?
Yeah. So here's one that I'm going to recommend. And again, this is coming from somebody who has a passion for the technical details and believes they're important. Um, there is a set of YouTube videos from Andrej Karpathy. He was a founder of OpenAI that left and went to Tesla and is now doing some interesting things around AI education. But he has a set of YouTube videos that kind of will walk you through and kind of give you a very gentle or an exposure to some um, Python programming as well. And he walks through it a very from ground up all the way to let's build GPT-2, one of the I think second generation large language models. And they're just a search for Andre Karpathy, Andreg is his first name. Karpathy is his last name. Search for him on YouTube. You'll find his YouTube channel. It's really a fantastic resource. And free and available. Um, the problem with recommending books is things change so quickly that it's hard to Pedro Domingo has a wonderful book that's a bit dated at this point called The Master Algorithm. It was written, I think, maybe 2015, and 2015 was a lifetime ago in this space, but it's still a very engaging kind of introduction to machine learning in general at a less technical level. Um, there's lots of Coursera classes around kind of intro to Python programming, or very kind of accessible things that would be good ways to kind of dip your toe into some of the technical tools that are very helpful when working in this space. I you know Engaged learners, people who are excited about this, have lots of resources available. It's one of the I think maybe back to the ethical question, one of the democratizing aspects of this technology.
Well, Michael, thank you again. And to our
Yeah.
attendees, thank you so much for being here. These conversations I find always so interesting. It's wonderful to hear from the faculty about their areas of expertise, the research that they're doing, and you also get a few insights about the learning experience here at
Oh, yeah.
Darden. So join us again November 14 will be the next one of these. Alex Cowan will be joining us. He'll be dialing in from the West Coast. So who knows? Maybe an interesting complement to this conversation. So Michael, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it was a pleasure. Thank you for having me, Brett.
All right. Have a good day, everybody. Have a nice weekend. And that was my conversation with Michael Albert, recorded as part of our ongoing Faculty Spotlight series, a series we call Office Hours. As always, if you have any comments, suggestions, requests, anything like for us to cover here on the podcast, we're all ears. We can be reached at Darden, that's DARDEN, @virginia.edu. Until next time, stay safe, be well, and thanks for listening.